Hey everybody, welcome to What the Flick. Bibbs, Alonso. Godzilla is back in town in his fourth Japanese iteration, if you want to get technical about it, not counting the American versions.
The amount of times Godzilla's been rebooted, and it's kind of complicated, and we're not going to get into it. That's a whole bag of words.
Yeah, we'll just say this is the fourth time around, but they're starting from scratch again.
Suffice it to say, every time America makes a Godzilla movie, whether it's Roland Emmerich or Gareth Edwards, Toho has to come back and they
clear the slate.
Both times they were done making Godzilla movies, and then America makes one, and Toho's got to be like, no.
We'll show you.
Here's what you meant. Let's take a look at. Shin Godzilla. Godzilla is back for the first time, and the Japanese government doesn't know what to do with it. It's a different take on Godzilla, and I think it's really interesting. Let's check it out.
When I posted my rap review on Facebook, I called it Gojira versus In the Loop.
Yeah, kind of, yeah. Because there's so much of this movie that is about the government bureaucracy. Yes. And I think it's actually really interesting because you look at the original Godzilla, and it was a very pointed metaphor for the A-bomb. The A-bomb. The A-bomb, and the way it was used in Japan at the end of World War II and the fallout thereof. And then Godzilla...
Literally.
And then Godzilla morphed into a bunch of different things as time went on, as franchises too.
Right.
And here we're taking it back to a metaphor, but it's a different metaphor this time. It's a metaphor for the nuclear reactor disaster in Japan. It's a metaphor for Japan's place in sort of contemporary geopolitics and how there's sort of a nation that's been held back in a lot of ways because of the aftermath of World War II, and here's an opportunity for them to, in this disaster, to not let America interfere and actually handle their own problems and kind of grow as a nation out of the 20th century, which makes it a rather pointed and almost poignant Godzilla movie.
Yeah, no, this is a very sharp political satire in a lot of ways, because in the old Godzilla movies, you would have like the government sort of, there would be meetings and conferences, and then they would rush to action. And this one, they have meetings and conferences, and they have more meetings and more conferences, and there's such a choking bureaucracy that nobody can do a damn thing. And there's like really super strict protocol about who can talk in meetings and whatever.
Yeah. Well, they have to change rooms sometimes.
Constantly.
Like at the beginning of the movie.
And wheel in more printers,
The movie opens with there's this big disaster thing that happens off the coast of Japan, and we don't know what it is. Might be a Godzilla, might not. Godzilla doesn't exist in this movie. In fact, there's a really funny scene where they Google the word Godzilla and only one hit comes up, which is also really, really funny. Godzilla is an American word that the Japanese translate to Gojira.
Yes.
That's cute. But yeah, so there's a big disaster, and then it's just bunch of people in suits having a meeting, going to another room to have a meeting, going back to the other room to have a meeting, having a meeting so long the movie actually stops and there's like a title card that says later. And you can tell it's supposed to be somewhat satirical.
Yeah,
which is great.
because there's this parade of chyrons where they're explaining like so-and-so, the associate minister of blah, 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 and the conference of the da-da-da. And there's so many of them in the first 2 minutes, you're like, oh, this is a joke. I got it.
Yeah, it takes a moment to catch on, but once you realize it, it's really funny.
And so it's a great sort of subtle commentary about the structure of things now, and then it expands out obviously later into where when the UN steps in and the Russians and the Chinese want to do this and the US wants to do this and they don't really care what Japan wants to do. Yeah. It's very much about that stuff. Meanwhile, Godzilla is happening. He goes from being this sort of
Meanwhile, Godzilla is happening is a great
There's
line.
this weird floppy sea slug with like puppet eyes who then becomes this sort of crazy CG creature with the atomic beam. But this is not friend to children Godzilla or Godzilla with a personality. This is Godzilla.
It's just an animal.
As an actual monster. And at one point, it looks like he's unhinging his jaw to eat a goat. Like his head just kind of opens up in this
What's
weird
kind of cool about Godzilla in this one, because it's a different take on Godzilla. Also, it's not a man in a suit, which I know some purists are mad about. I think he looks fine for the most part. There's a couple of shots that are kind of wonky. But yeah, he's just like this deep sea animal that ran afoul of some radiation. and started growing and evolving at an exponential rate. And then when he winds up on land, his legs haven't even evolved yet. He's just sort of mashing into things like a tidal wave, which is, again, another rather pointed idea. A lot of people made fun of like his googly eyes, which I totally get. But if he was a deep sea animal, his eyes would be huge and unblinking, like like an anglerfish, if you will. So that kind of made sense. It's a little distracting, but what are you going to do? I was fine with it. But yeah, then he just keeps evolving. But what's cool about him is there's no malice. He's not like an expression of nature's rage or anything like that. He's just this big dumb animal that needs to be dealt with.
Yeah.
Even when we attack him, he fights back because why wouldn't he? It feels more like, in a way, more like King Kong. In that element of Godzilla is maybe not tragic because there's no one saying. There's a couple people saying Godzilla needs to be captured alive for scientific purposes, but there's no bleeding heart, person, in cargo shorts saying, we have to protect Godzilla. No, we have to deal with Godzilla. He's a huge problem. And I admire that about it. I think it's surprisingly complex and kind of interesting, although I do think it's kind of funny that Toho's response to the American Godzilla is to make a Godzilla where there's not a whole lot of Godzilla.
True, yeah. I mean, but I remember when I did not like the Gareth Edwards Godzilla as much as you did, and when I complained about how long it takes to get to the monster stuff, people were like, oh, but that's how the Godzilla movies have always been. Yes, but
some of them.
Some of them, and I think also you have to judge these movies by what's going to happen when Godzilla's not on screen.
Yeah.
In the Gareth Edwards one, I didn't give two shits about the love story or about Bryan Cranston running around trying to solve things. This movie, I at least enjoyed the kind of the satirical elements. I like that they kind of put together this team of like science nerds, who are all weirdly sort of deadpan about solving stuff.
They even have a speech about we're all the black sheep. We're all the people who don't fit into the
pains
system.
And the bureaucracy.
Yeah, which is basically, and it's only going to fall to them to save the bureaucracy, ironically enough, which is really great. But you're right. That is the biggest problem with Gareth Edwards is that just the human characters are paper thin. Now, I liked the highlights enough that they got me through the movie, but that's the problem. And this is just all the human characters. I mean, there's a lot of them, and maybe not all of them have big moments or that you really get on board or even know who they are, but like the ones you do, you do latch onto, the ones you do care about, they're more interesting, they have more going on, there's more at stake for them other than just getting back home to my generic family.
Right.
It really is a distinctive, interesting Godzilla movie, the kind of which I don't think a lot of people, especially younger audiences who haven't seen all the Godzilla movies, have seen. And I think it's really cool, and I would recommend anybody see it.
Totally, yeah. And I'm okay with there being less sort of, buildings falling down. Because also this movie, we're so used to from the old ones, especially the kind of like the cardboard skyscrapers. This is genuinely terrifying kind of like city destruction stuff. And
a lot of people would die.
Yeah, and I was thinking,
it's not funny.
I was thinking about 9/11, because that so often comes up in these kind of mass disaster movies now, but also because as easy as it might be to go like, oh, well, Japan needs to get its act together. Let's not forget, 9/11 is where we discovered that the New York City police departments and New York City fire department were on different radio networks and couldn't communicate with each other. So, and certainly I think trying to evacuate any major U.S. city would be as nightmarish as the attempts to evacuate Tokyo in this movie. So I think the idea of disaster preparedness is probably something that we're all not keeping up with as well as we should. And this movie is a pointed reminder about how stuff can just come up out of nowhere and you got to deal with it.
We've seen so many Godzilla movies, good Godzilla movies, that were basically all about giant monster fights. And those giant monster fights were, for the most part, awesome.
Yes.
Totally fine with that. But it's really, really cool to see a reboot of a horror movie that gets back to the sort of general idea of what made it work for the first place and then adapts that into a contemporary
and makes it
form.
Frightening. I can't remember the last time I was frightened by a Godzilla movie.
And this is the one because it's not about the bomb, but it is about disasters and the way civilizations, the way governments, and the way people respond to them. How it inspires us to great things. How it exposes people who are bad at their jobs.
Right. Exactly.
And that's very effective, and it's impressive work.
If I had to pick out one thing that did bug me, there's a character who is an American-raised Japanese woman who has like political ambitions in the U.S. and is well connected, and they send her to Japan to deal with stuff. And it's interesting that she doesn't, she doesn't know all the protocols and stuff and talks about that. But her English is terrible.
That's the irony.
And if you're an English-speaking audience, you know her English is terrible.
Yeah.
And
well, maybe not terrible, but she's obviously not a native speaker.
it's not her first language.
Yeah,
That's the thing.
yeah.
For somebody who's supposed to be like raised in America and awkward in Japan, she does. You know, you can tell if you speak English, you know immediately that's not the case.
Yeah, it's
and
a
that
little
actually came up in that Jia Zhangke movie that came out this year called Mountains Made Apart, where there's a segment of the film that's set in the future where you have all these Chinese people who were raised in Hong Kong speaking English who've now returned to the mainland and are taking Chinese lessons to learn Chinese because they don't know how to speak Mandarin. But when they speak English, you can tell that English is not their first language. It's kind of like, guys, these movies are going to be seen by a global audience. Cast somebody who speaks English if the fact that they speak English is essential to the character.
I think filmmakers are still getting used to that idea of the global audience on all fronts because, you know, let's be honest here, if that had been the case for someone speaking a language that the majority of the American audiences were not familiar with, the majority of American audiences probably wouldn't ding the film on it.
No, of course not.
You know, like I'm just saying, we have to catch up.
No,
I'm understanding, but we need to catch up.
I'm saying if their first language is supposed to be French, like still cast somebody who speaks French because somebody in France is going to see that movie and be like and call bullshit on it.
Yeah.
This movie is being released kind of. What is the deal with how this movie is being released exactly?
It had a special screening earlier this week. I think you can still catch
There's
it.
a couple more
theaters.
this weekend, yeah.
And I would recommend seeing it on a big screen if you can. But if you see it at home on VOD or however you can get it on home video, whatever format,
still worth it.
Still worth it. Still looks great. But I kind of wish I had to see this on a screen, or I kind of wish I'd seen it on the big screen.
Yeah, same here.
Because there's some really, really cool destruction. There's a really, really good sense of scale to this movie that I think even some of the better other Godzilla movies don't always get. Sure. So
what's your number?
I'm giving it an 8. Okay. Solid recommendation. Didn't blow my mind or anything like that, but this is a good Godzilla movie, and this is kind of what we want from a Godzilla movie, I think.
Absolutely, yeah. I went 7.5. I think it's very strong, and if you know whether or not you're a fan of the series or the character, you know, I think you should check it out.
If this is your first Godzilla movie, this is a good Godzilla movie.
Oh yeah, no, totally a good place to hop in. So it's a 7.8 from us, and on the
76 on Rotten Tomatoes.
Okay.
So that's what are we like a 7.7, 7.8? I'm bad at math.
We're 7.8. Yeah.
7.8 for
and
us.
76 on the tomato meter. Yeah, check out Shin Godzilla. Thanks, Bibbs.
Thank you.